Since Zenus no longer had to worry about Krishna, things returned to normal for him and Layli. But Zenus' life hadn't always been so good. As a child, he was a miserable orphan living in the back alleys of the slums, with nothing going for him. He spent his days sitting aimlessly in some alleyway. One day, Aston was walking through the slums trying to decide which child to kidnap. Up to that point, he had been disappointed, as none of the kids seemed good enough to serve as a human shield. That's when he saw Zenus and decided to take him. He approached and started conversation. Basically, he said, "You're poor, unemployed, and starving, so come with me on an adventure." He spoke politely with a gentle yet fake tone, which made Zenus believe he was a good person. However, Zenus was hesitant, since slum dwellers usually weren't allowed to become adventurers. But Aston told him that if he had any skills, he could do anything. Then he asked Zenus if he knew how to do anything. Zenus replied that he knew a bit of healing magic. Aston didn't believe him for a second, since learning healing magic required years of study at the Royal Academy. There was no way a random orphan could have learned it on his own. Even though he didn't believe Zenus, Aston just wanted to use him as a distraction in case things went south. When Zenus agreed to go with him, the two headed into the forest, where they encountered a wolf monster. During the fight, Aston got a bit injured, so Zenus used his magic to heal him. Then Aston charged at the monster again, and Zenus used his healing magic once more to boost Aston's speed. With that burst, Aston managed to decapitate the wolf in a single blow. However, he didn't realize that his wounds had healed mid-battle or that he had suddenly become faster, so he concluded that Zenus was completely useless. After a few years together, Aston eventually kicked Zenus out of the group, and we already know what Zenus did after that. But Aston's group wasn't so lucky. After getting rid of Zenus, they headed to a cave for their next mission. This mission was especially important because they hoped to use it to earn the favor of the kingdom's powerful nobles. But everyone hated the work involved. Yuma commented that the faster they finished the job, the sooner they could get back to the inn and keep drinking. Andres was excited, since women always fawned over them when they mentioned they were part of the Golden Phoenix group. After all, the group was famous for completing quests and slaying magical beasts without getting injured. That's when they encountered the monsters they had come to eliminate. Aston drew his sword and prepared to attack, asking Guile to cast a defensive spell on him. Guile did exactly that. Still, as Aston fought the wolves, he ended up with a burn arm. At the same time, Yuma was being attacked by a wolf in the rear, making him useless in the fight. Aston shouted at Andrew to hurry up and cast some offensive magic, but he took forever to finish the spell and ended up getting hit by a fireball in the middle of his chant. Aston was stunned and wondered if his team had always been this useless. It was clear they wouldn't win the fight, so he ordered an immediate retreat. Outside, Aston asked why they were struggling with monsters that, at most, were rank B. Andrew shot back that Aston hadn't done much against the wolves either. Then Guile asked if maybe Zenus had been telling the truth when he said he healed them during battles. But Aston dismissed the idea, saying there was no way a low-born peasant like Zenus could have used healing magic. Just to be safe, Aston thought it would be a good idea to hire a healer for the group. A few days later, they returned to the cave with the newly hired healer. Her name was Ma, but she warned Aston right away that she wasn't suited for battlefield healing. She usually worked in the capital, treating patients in controlled conditions, and had only agreed to come along because she happened to have an adventurer's license. Still, she found it odd that the Golden Phoenix group would need a healer at all, since they were famous for completing missions without a scratch. Aston didn't want to explain what had happened, and simply told her to mind her own business. Guile asked Ma if Yuma would be all right, since he had been severely wounded by the wolves during their last mission. Ma said Elmo had been the one to treat him, and she believed Yuma would survive, but given how serious the injuries were, it would be impossible for him to return to adventuring. One might expect Aston to show some compassion for a teammate who had been permanently disabled, but instead, he just brushed it off and said Yuma wasn't worth keeping the group anyway. And if you're wondering why this particular mission is so important, it's because a local lord wanted to make a scarf out of the pelt of a fire fox as a gift for his daughter. And if that meant winning Lord Fennel's favor, Aston was willing to risk his life for the scarf. However, not even 2 seconds later, the plan started to fall apart when the wolves launched a surprise attack. Aston jumped into action and told Guile to cast a defensive spell on everyone. But as he advanced, Aston couldn't land a single blow on the wolves. Then, the wolves fired 4 fireballs at him. Aston managed to block 3, but the last one hit Andrew in the abdomen, knocking him out of the fight. Aston kept trying to fight the wolves with no success, until Ma screamed that they needed to fall back. Andrew was in critical condition. Aston couldn't believe everything was falling apart again. As soon as they got out of the cave, he yelled at Guile, demanding to know why he hadn't protected Andrew with his magic. But Ma clarified that Guile's defensive magic had worked. Without it, Andrew would have died instantly. Aston told her to hurry and heal him, but Ma said that wasn't possible. Only advanced healers or saints could treat wounds like that without special preparation. So unless they got Andrew to a hospital immediately, he would die. Later, Aston met with Lord Fennel's servant, who told him the Lord was deeply disappointed. Aston begged for another chance, convinced he could retrieve the pelt if they tried again. But Fennel's daughter's birthday had already passed, so there was no longer any reason. And the reason for Fennel's disappointment wasn't that the Golden Phoenix had failed a mission. It was that Aston had kept insisting he could complete it. If Aston had simply told Fennel that the mission was impossible for any reason, the Lord would have accepted it and arranged for another gift. But that's not what happened, is it? For a moment, Aston tried to blame everything on Zenas. But then he remembered that Zenas had never been officially registered as a member of the group. So, officially, Zenas had never been part of the team and couldn't be held responsible. In the end, Aston was forced to bow his head and apologize for all the trouble he'd caused, but he hated having to grovel before a mere servant. He promises he'll make it up to them, but Lord Fennel's servant asks how he plans to do that when half of his companions are practically dead. Aston assures him that he intends to recruit new members to make up for the losses and guarantees that the next time Lord Fennel issues a mission, he will see it through to completion. With that, the servant leaves, but Guile questions whether it's really a good idea to make promises like that. After all, they have no leads on skilled people to recruit, and there's no way the two of them could handle missions on their own. Aston tells Guile not to worry, because he already has a plan. He still doesn't think much of Zenas, but he can't deny the group worked better when Zenas was around. That's why Aston plans to bring him back, and is convinced that Zenas must be desperate to return to Golden Phoenix, despite the terrible way he was treated. The next day, Aston and Guile head to the slums in search of Zenas, but they have no idea where to start. Then Aston has a brilliant idea. Hire the 3 faction leaders to help find Zenas, and he's sure they'll do it. After all, according to him, low-level people will do anything for money. Soon after, a lizard man leads him to Zafia, and Aston tells her he wants to hire her for a job. Zafia isn't particularly interested, as it gets in the way of her daily clinic visit, but she's willing to hear out a paying customer. Aston introduces himself as the leader of Golden Phoenix, and tells Zafia he's looking for a man named Zenas, who arrived in the slums about 2 months ago. Zafia can hardly believe what she's hearing, since Zenas had already told her all about how Aston kicked him out of Golden Phoenix. That was already a stupid decision, but she never imagined Aston would be dumb enough to come looking for him afterward. She tells Aston to get lost, because Zenas has better things to do than see him, and honestly, the mere sight of Aston disgusts her. Aston is offended and, for a moment, considers attacking Zafia, but he realizes he'd get beaten to a pulp, so he backs down. With Zafia refusing to help, Aston tries seeking help from Linga's faction, but as soon as she finds out who he is, she sends him away. Aston is stunned to realize that Linga is also a friend of Zenas, and he thinks about making a scene, but Linga reminds him she could kill him 3 times over before he even blinked. Aston then tries to ask Lou for help, but just like the others, she tells him to go straight to hell. She even warns him that if she finds out he's bothering Zenas, she'll crush his head between her thighs herself. Aston and Guile immediately leave Lou's cave, and Aston can't believe all the faction leaders care so much about Zenas. He tries to convince himself they must be talking about a different guy with the same name, because the Zenas he knows couldn't possibly have that much influence around here. But speaking of Zenas, Guile eventually spots him walking down the street with Laylee. Zenas and Laylee had just finished their daily shopping, and were about to head home when Aston suddenly called out to him. Zenas was surprised to see Aston and Guile again, but didn't like the sight of them at all, so he started walking away. Aston stopped him and shouted that he came all the way there specifically to invite him back to Golden Phoenix. But before he could even finish his sentence, Zenas refused. Aston couldn't believe it. He had been so sure Zenas would be grateful for the chance to come back to the group. Zenas began listing everything Aston had put him through the last time. The poor treatment, the miserable pay. There was literally no reason for him to return to the Golden Phoenix. But if Aston was truly that desperate, Zenas said he was willing to accompany him on a few missions, if he had the time. However, he outright refused to work for exposure again. This time, Aston would have to pay him properly. Zenas demanded $50,000 for minor wound healing and a full $1 million for critical wound recovery. Additionally, Aston would have to pay extra for his defensive magic and buffs. If Aston wasn't willing to pay that price, then there was nothing more to discuss. Zenas began to walk away again. Aston was offended by Zenas' audacity and drew his sword, trying to attack him. But before he could do anything, he was struck down by Krishna. She told him it was pretty stupid to attack someone in front of a royal knight. She had come there because she wanted to see Zenas, but now that Aston had just attempted an assault, she'd have to arrest him. However, Aston bolted. He had no intention of ending up in jail. After all the chaos, Zenas and Laylee returned home. Not long after, Zofia, Linga, and Lou showed up. They told Zenas that Aston had tried to hire them to track him down. Although they had all refused, Zofia was concerned that he might keep going after Zenas. If Aston turned to the illegal underworld guild, he might end up hiring an assassin out of spite. On the other hand, assassins were expensive, and if he had been desperate enough to come after Zenas instead of recruiting new team members, then he was probably broke. Even so, Zofia remained uneasy. There were rumors of a man known as a guide in the underworld guild who accepted jobs for free under certain conditions. If Aston managed to convince that guy, Zenas could be in real danger. Later that night, Zenas couldn't sleep, still stressed out from his run-in with Aston. Camila came downstairs to sit with him, worried about how he was doing. While they talked, she asked if it was true that he had learned healing magic in the slums. Zenas explained that he had been trying to revive a corpse, and healing magic had come to him naturally after that. Camila warned him that resurrection magic was forbidden, but Zenas defended himself, saying he hadn't known that at the time. Speaking of forbidden magic, Camila remembered something similar to artificial life from when she was still alive. Back then, during the era of the Demon King, he would often wage war using golems brought to life by forbidden spells. At that moment, Zenas heard a noise outside, and Camila offered to check. To her horror, she saw a large portion of the slums engulfed in flames and a golem rampaging through them.